The creatures most likely to survive are usually the ones least afraid of change. General Vaelira Thorn first noticed something unusual about the human 3 hours before the fleet reached the surface. The bridge of the command ship felt tense despite the controlled silence. Officers moved between stations reviewing environmental reports for what seemed like the 100th time. Massive holographic displays filled the air with warnings. Atmospheric instability, toxic biological systems, extreme weather patterns, predatory ecosystem density beyond acceptable military thresholds. The planet below had earned a classification feared across the galaxy. Deathworld. Even experienced officers checked their equipment twice before deployment. Some checked 3 times. Yet one person aboard the ship seemed completely unaffected. Mason Reed sat alone near the medical station drinking coffee. Not synthetic nutrient fluid. Not military stimulant concentrate. Coffee. Steam rose from the metal cup while he calmly reviewed inventory lists. The human combat medic looked as relaxed as someone preparing for a routine day at work. General Vaelira observed him through a transparent command display. Royal blue skin, silver white hair, violet eyes trained on the tactical projections floating above the bridge. She had commanded fleets for nearly 12 years and learned to recognize fear long before soldiers admitted it. Fear showed itself in small ways. Faster breathing, nervous movements, repeated equipment checks. Mason displayed none of them. "Has he read the environmental report?" she asked. A nearby officer nodded. 3 times, General. Vaelira frowned slightly. And he asked whether the rain forecast would interfere with field medical scanners. The officer hesitated. That was his only question. Several command staff exchanged puzzled looks. The general turned her attention back toward the planet. Even from orbit, it looked hostile. Vast crimson forests covered entire continents. Mountain ranges stretched across thousands of miles beneath permanent storm systems. Electrical activity flashed through dense cloud layers. Sensors continuously detected unfamiliar life forms moving below. Nothing about the world appeared welcoming. The deployment warnings sounded throughout the vessel. Crew members immediately began moving toward transport bays. Conversations became shorter. Expressions became more serious. Mason calmly finished his coffee. "General," one officer asked quietly, "should the human medic remain aboard until the first survey teams establish safe zones?" The suggestion made sense. Human physiology was considered adaptable by galactic standards, but Deathworld environments challenged every species. Vaelira studied the medic again. He had already begun organizing emergency medical packs with methodical precision. No hesitation. No concern. "Perhaps," she said. Minutes later, she entered the transport preparation area personally. Dozens of soldiers checked equipment beneath bright overhead lights. Mason stood near a supply container securing field medical kits. The general approached. "Medic Reed." He looked up immediately. "General, you understand the environmental risks below?" "Yes, General. This world is classified beyond standard operational thresholds. I read the report." His answer was calm, respectful, simple. Vaelira folded her arms. "Then you understand why I am considering keeping you aboard the ship until conditions are evaluated." Around them, several soldiers paused to listen. Most expected the human to agree. Instead, Mason glanced toward the transport bay doors where the planet slowly rotated beyond reinforced glass. A faint smile touched his face. Not excitement. Recognition. "With respect, General," he said quietly, "the weather down there does not look too bad." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then several nearby officers stared at him as though they had misheard the sentence entirely. Outside the ship, lightning flashed across an entire continent. Inside the bay, Mason returned to organizing medical supplies as if nothing unusual had been said. And for the first time since receiving the mission briefing, General Vaelira Thorn found herself wondering whether the human knew something the rest of the fleet did not. The transports descended through the atmosphere 40 minutes later. Mason Reed sat near the rear of the shuttle while soldiers around him monitored environmental readings appearing across their wrist displays. The cabin lights flickered occasionally as electrical storms flashed outside. Rain hammered against the reinforced hull like handfuls of metal fragments. Through narrow observation ports, crimson forests stretched across the landscape below. Even from the air, the planet looked alive in a way that unsettled most species. General Valyra Thorne stood near the front of the transport reviewing deployment procedures. Every few minutes, another warning appeared on the tactical display. Extreme biological activity. Unstable weather systems. Unknown airborne microorganisms. The list continued growing. Yet each time Valyra glanced toward Mason, she found the human quietly checking medical supplies with the same calm expression. Eventually, the shuttle landed on a rocky plateau overlooking miles of dense red vegetation. The rear ramp lowered. Humid air rushed inside immediately. Several officers instinctively stepped back. The atmosphere carried unfamiliar scents mixed with mineral-rich moisture. Distant thunder rolled across the horizon. Survey teams began deploying equipment while security units established a perimeter. Mason exited the transport carrying 2 medical packs and immediately looked toward the sky. Dark clouds moved rapidly overhead. The general approached him. "Stay close to the primary team." "Of course, General. I mean it." "I know." Something about his response sounded unusual. Not disrespectful. Not dismissive. More like someone reassuring another person. Valyra narrowed her eyes slightly. Before she could continue, a science officer hurried across the landing zone. "General, sensors are detecting significant environmental fluctuations." The officer activated a holographic display. "Wind speeds are increasing faster than projected." Mason glanced briefly at the readings. "You should move the communications tower." The officer blinked. "What?" The human pointed toward a cluster of rocks roughly 70 yards away. "Put it there instead." Several nearby crew members exchanged confused looks. The science officer checked his display again. "Our models show the current position is optimal." Mason simply shrugged. "Your choice." Work continued. Equipment was assembled. Temporary shelters were deployed. The communications tower remained exactly where the scientists wanted it. 20 minutes later, a powerful gust swept across the plateau. The tower collapsed without warning. Fortunately, nobody was injured. The structure simply toppled onto the wet ground while technicians stared in disbelief. Mason looked up from organizing emergency supplies. "That was sooner than I expected." Now people were staring at him. The science officer approached immediately. "How did you know that would happen?" Mason considered the question. The clouds. The clouds. And the way the birds stopped flying." The officer looked even more confused. "What birds?" Mason pointed toward the distant forest. "Exactly." Silence followed. The officer slowly turned toward the horizon. The skies above the crimson trees were empty. Completely empty. Valyra had noticed the same thing only now. Moments earlier, strange winged creatures had filled the air. They were gone. Every single one. Another low rumble echoed through the distance. Mason zipped his medical pack closed and calmly stood. "You may want everyone under shelter within the next 10 minutes. The general stared at him. "Why?" The human looked toward the darkening sky. "Because something big is about to happen." For reasons she could not explain, General Valyra Thorne suddenly trusted that answer more than any sensor aboard the fleet. The storm arrived 9 minutes later. Not 10. 9. That detail bothered the science team more than the weather itself. General Valyra Thorne stood beneath the reinforced shelter watching sheets of silver rain sweep across the plateau. Winds howled through the rocky landscape with enough force to bend sensor masts and shake transport landing struts. Yet inside the temporary operations center, another conversation had begun. Every officer wanted to know how the human medic had predicted the event. Mason Reed sat at a folding equipment table calmly recalibrating medical scanners. Around him, researchers compared atmospheric data, reviewed wildlife recordings, and searched for explanations. None of them found one. There was no warning in the sensor logs, a scientist muttered. The weather shift should not have happened for another hour. Mason adjusted a diagnostic setting without looking up. The weather was not the warning. Several heads turned immediately. "What does that mean?" another officer asked. The human pointed toward the shelter entrance. Beyond the transparent barrier, rain hammered against the rocks. The warning was everything else. The room fell silent. Mason finally looked up. The birds disappeared. That could be coincidence. The insects disappeared too. Nobody answered. The air pressure changed. A scientist checked a nearby display. His eyes widened slightly. It did. Mason continued. The smell changed. Now the entire room stared at him. "The smell?" one officer repeated. "The plants released defensive spores about 15 minutes before the storm arrived." The scientist nearest the environmental console quickly reviewed biological data. His expression became increasingly confused. He is correct. General Veilira crossed her arms. You noticed all of that in a few minutes? Mason shrugged. It was fairly obvious. The response generated several looks of disbelief. Nothing about it had been obvious to anyone else. Hours passed while the storm continued outside. During that time, something unusual happened. More predictions followed. Mason suggested relocating a power relay before moisture damaged it. 30 minutes later, flooding reached the original position. He advised survey teams to avoid a section of forest because local wildlife would likely migrate through the area. Less than an hour afterward, thousands of large herbivores emerged from the trees and crossed the exact route originally planned. Again and again, the humans seemed to know what the planet would do before the planet did it. By evening, curiosity had replaced skepticism. Even the scientists had stopped arguing. General Veilira found Mason standing alone near the shelter entrance watching the rain. Crimson lightning flashed across distant mountains. The red forest below moved like a living ocean beneath the storm. You have been here before, she said. Mason smiled faintly. Not this planet. Then how do you know these things? For the first time, the human hesitated. Not because he seemed unwilling to answer. More because he appeared unsure how to explain something simple. Places like this follow patterns, he said. Most dangerous environments do. The general studied him carefully. Most species avoid environments like this. Probably a good idea. Another flash of crimson lightning illuminated the horizon. Then Mason spoke almost absent-mindedly. This one is not even in my top 5. Veilira blinked. Top 5 what? The human immediately looked as though he wished he had not said anything. Nothing. Medic. Mason sighed quietly. Top 5 difficult worlds. Silence followed. The general stared at him. Outside, thunder rolled across the wilderness. Inside, a strange feeling settled into her thoughts. Earlier, she had wondered whether the human knew something the fleet did not. Now a different question emerged. Exactly how many worlds like this had Mason Reed experienced before arriving here? The storm finally passed during the night. By dawn, the world looked entirely different. Thick mist drifted across the plateau. Crimson leaves glistened beneath pale sunlight. The air felt cleaner, quieter, almost peaceful. That illusion lasted less than 20 minutes. General Veilira Thorne stood beside the primary survey station reviewing overnight reports when an urgent call arrived from the science division. Researchers had discovered an abandoned structure nearly 3 miles from the landing zone. Initial scans suggested artificial origins. The possibility immediately drew attention across the camp. Ancient ruins on a Deathworld were rare. Ancient ruins that survived the environment were almost unheard of. Within an hour, a survey team prepared to investigate. Veilira joined the expedition personally. Several scientists accompanied her along with security personnel and, despite her earlier concerns, Mason Reed. The group traveled through dense crimson vegetation beneath towering trees whose branches disappeared into low clouds. Strange calls echoed through the forest. Massive roots twisted across the ground like frozen rivers. Every few hundred yards, researchers stopped to collect samples. Mason seemed far more interested in the surrounding landscape than the ruins. He occasionally paused to examine plants or study tracks left in the mud. After nearly 2 hours, the team reached the site. The structure emerged from the mist like the skeleton of a forgotten civilization. Black stone walls rose from the forest floor. Vines covered much of the exterior. Portions of the building had collapsed long ago, but enough remained intact to suggest extraordinary age. Scientists immediately began scanning the area. Excited voices filled the communication channels. Then something unexpected happened. Mason stopped walking. His expression changed slightly. Not fear. Concentration. The general noticed immediately. What is it? She asked. The human looked around the clearing. This place feels wrong. Several scientists exchanged amused looks. One of them laughed quietly. That is not exactly a scientific observation. Mason ignored the comment. His gaze moved toward the tree line surrounding the ruins. How long have we been here? About 6 minutes, Veilira answered. The human nodded slowly. Too long. Before anyone could ask what he meant, Mason walked toward a nearby scanner station. He studied the environmental readings for only a few seconds. Then he pointed toward one section of the forest. There, the lead scientist frowned. They're what? The animals. What animals? Mason looked directly at him. Exactly. Silence followed. Once again, people began checking their instruments. Birds, insects, small life forms. The entire area surrounding the ruins was empty. Completely empty. The realization spread through the team, one person at a time. A forest that active should have been filled with movement. Instead, there was only silence. The kind of silence that felt unnatural. The general looked toward Mason. You noticed immediately. Not immediately. He glanced upward. About 30 seconds after we arrived. The scientists quickly reviewed sensor recordings. Moments later, one researcher suddenly stiffened. General. His voice sounded uneasy. We have a problem. A holographic display appeared above the scanner. Beneath the ruins, hidden deep underground, lay an enormous network of tunnels stretching for miles in every direction. The map continued expanding as additional scans arrived. Some passages were wider than city streets. Others descended beyond the range of available sensors. No one spoke. Finally, the scientists swallowed. These tunnels are occupied. The forest remained silent around them. Mason stared at the display for several seconds. Then he quietly set down his medical bag. We should probably leave. For the second time in 2 days, General Valera felt a chill of concern. And for the second time in 2 days, it came not from the planet itself, but from the fact that the human medic already seemed to understand exactly what was happening. The return journey to the landing zone happened much faster than the trip out. Nobody argued with that decision. The discovery beneath the ruins had changed the mood of the expedition completely. Scientists who had been excited moments earlier now walked in thoughtful silence. Security teams maintained constant surveillance of the surrounding forest. Even the air felt different. Heavier. More watchful. Mason Reed remained near the center of the group, carrying his medical pack, while General Valera Thorne reviewed updated sensor reports. The underground tunnel network continued expanding as orbiting satellites refined their scans. New passages appeared every few minutes. Some stretched dozens of miles beneath the surface. Others connected to regions the expedition had not yet explored. By the time the team reached the camp, a crowd had already gathered around the central operations station. Researchers, officers, and analysts studied holographic maps suspended above a circular command table. The tunnel system now occupied most of the display. Any conclusions? Valera asked. The chief scientist shook his head. Not yet. He enlarged one section of the map. The structure appears ancient. Another section expanded. The tunnels appear much newer. Meaning something moved into the ruins long after they were built. The answer generated another wave of uncomfortable silence. The general noticed Mason standing quietly near the edge of the gathering. His eyes moved across the map with unusual focus. Almost familiarity. What are you thinking? She asked. The human hesitated. The tunnels are not the interesting part. Several scientists immediately turned toward him. Then what is? Mason pointed toward the center of the display. The pattern. Analysts exchanged puzzled looks. One technician quickly overlaid a grid across the map. Moments later, his expression changed. General. He sounded surprised. The tunnels are not random. The holographic image shifted. Suddenly, the enormous underground network revealed a deliberate structure. Rings. Layers. Connections. The design resembled something between a city and a living organism. The room became very quiet. How did you notice that? The technician asked. Mason shrugged. I have seen similar layouts before. Every head in the room turned toward him. General Valera narrowed her eyes. Where? The human immediately seemed to regret speaking. A long time ago. On another world? Something like that. Before anyone could continue questioning him, a warning signal appeared above the command table. An automated notification from the fleet database. The message identified a historical reference match connected to the tunnel design. Researchers quickly opened the file. The display flickered. Then a classification notice appeared. Access restricted. Multiple officers groaned in frustration. It was not the first restricted record encountered during the mission. However, before the file disappeared completely, a brief data fragment became visible. Only for a second. Yet it was enough. General Valera saw it. So did several analysts. The reference contained 2 lines. Species classification, Deathworld adapted. Survival case reference, Reed, Mason. The file vanished immediately afterward. Silence filled the operations center. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Mason slowly closed his eyes. Not because he was frightened, more because he looked tired. Very tired. The general stared at him. "Survival case reference?" she asked quietly. The human rubbed the back of his neck. "That file was supposed to stay sealed." "What file?" Mason did not answer immediately. Outside, evening light painted the crimson forest gold. Inside, every person in the camp waited. Finally, the human looked toward the projection one last time. "It is nothing important." The response fooled absolutely no one. For the first time since arriving on the Deathworld, General Valyra felt certain of one thing. Mason Reed was hiding far more than experience. Somewhere behind those restricted records was a story important enough for entire databases to protect. And somehow, that story was connected directly to him. That night, nobody slept particularly well. The discovery of the restricted record had spread through the camp faster than any official announcement. Researchers whispered about it over evening meals. Officers quietly compared theories. Security personnel reviewed archive databases searching for additional references. Every search produced the same result. Access denied. Access restricted. Access unavailable. It was as though someone had deliberately buried Mason Reed's past beneath layers of classification protocols. The strange part was that the human himself seemed completely unconcerned. General Valyra Thorne found him shortly after sunrise sitting outside the medical shelter drinking coffee while dense morning fog rolled across the plateau. The crimson forest beyond the camp looked almost peaceful beneath the pale light. Almost. "You knew people would start asking questions," the general said. Mason looked up from his cup. "Probably. And questions are normal." Valyra folded her arms. "Answers would also be helpful." A faint smile appeared on the human's face. "That depends on the question." Before she could continue, an urgent call came through the command network. The science division had successfully recovered a corrupted fragment from the restricted archive. Everyone was requested at the operations center immediately. Within minutes, the command tent filled with personnel. Holographic displays illuminated anxious faces. Analysts stood beside processing stations while researchers reviewed recovered data. The chief scientist activated the file. "We only retrieved a small section." He looked toward Mason briefly. "But it appears authentic." The projection expanded above the room. Lines of information scrolled across the display. Personnel Survival Registry. Environmental Adaptation Program. Subject: Reed, Mason. Then additional entries appeared beneath his name. Deathworld 1. Survived. Deathworld 2. Survived. Deathworld 3. Survived. The room became silent. More entries continued appearing. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The list kept going. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Finally, the sequence stopped. Deathworld 15. Survived. Complete silence filled the operations center. General Valyra stared at the display. She had expected unusual experience. Perhaps 2 or 3 hazardous deployments. Maybe 4. 15 was beyond comprehension. Most explorers never visited a single death world. Many military officers avoided them entirely. Yet somehow the quiet medic standing near the back of the room had survived 15 separate environments classified among the most dangerous worlds in known space. One scientist swallowed hard. "This cannot be accurate." Another analyst checked the file authentication. "It is." A third researcher slowly shook his head. "Nobody survives 15. Mason took another sip of coffee. Apparently somebody did. Every head turned toward him. The human immediately looked as though he regretted speaking. Valyra stepped closer. 15? She asked quietly. Yes. How? Mason considered the question for several seconds. One day at a time. The answer generated equal amounts of frustration and disbelief. The general stared at him. You are serious. Completely. The room remained silent. Then another section of the recovered file appeared unexpectedly. Several entries included environmental rankings. The first few worlds carried moderate death world classifications. Later entries became increasingly severe. By the final records, the rankings had reached levels rarely discussed outside specialized scientific communities. Researchers reviewed the numbers in stunned silence. One analyst finally whispered, "These worlds should not have been inhabited by anything." Mason nodded. Some of them were not. Nobody laughed. The statement sounded entirely sincere. For the first time since arriving on the planet, General Veolyra realized she had been asking the wrong question all along. The mystery was no longer why Mason understood Deathworlds. The mystery was how a human medic had somehow survived enough of them to become a legend hidden inside classified archives. The atmosphere inside the camp changed completely after the file was recovered. People still treated Mason Reed respectfully, but now another emotion had appeared. All researchers who previously viewed him as a quiet medic now studied him the way archaeologists studied ancient discoveries. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the same impossible number. 15. 15 Deathworlds. 15 environments severe enough to receive classifications that frightened explorers, scientists, and military commanders alike. Yet the human himself continued performing routine medical inspections as though nothing unusual had happened. General Veolyra Thorne watched him from across the operations center late that evening. Outside, the crimson forest glowed beneath the fading light of sunset. Inside, analysts continued searching through recovered archives. Most records remained inaccessible, but a few fragments had survived. One researcher suddenly stood. "General." His voice carried unusual excitement. "We found another reference." The room immediately grew quiet. A holographic display expanded above the central table. The recovered record contained only a brief summary. Most details remained hidden. Yet one line was visible. Final survival assessment. Deathworld 15. Environmental status, unsustainable. Population status, none. Recommended evacuation, impossible. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then one scientist looked toward Mason. There was nobody else there? The human shook his head. "Not when I arrived." The scientist stared. "You live there alone?" Mason considered the question. For a while, the room became silent again. Even the equipment seemed quieter. General Veolyra slowly approached the table. "How long is a while?" she asked. Mason looked toward the ceiling as though calculating. "About 14 months. Several researchers visibly froze. 14 months. On a world officially classified as unsustainable. A planet that could not support permanent settlement. The numbers made no sense. "Why?" the general asked softly. For the first time since the mission began, Mason did not answer immediately. The silence lasted long enough that nobody interrupted it. Finally, he sat down near the edge of the room and looked through the transparent shelter wall toward the distant forest. "Because the rescue ships could not reach me." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Mason's voice remained calm. "There was a navigation accident." He shrugged lightly. "Things happened." The understatement generated several expressions of disbelief. Things happened. 14 months alone on one of the most dangerous worlds in known space somehow became things happened. The general sat across from him. "What was it like?" The question lingered in the air. Mason remained quiet for several moments. Then he smiled faintly. Not because the memory seemed pleasant, more because it felt distant. "The first month was difficult. And after that I learned the rules." The scientists immediately leaned forward. "Rules?" one asked. Mason nodded. "Every Deathworld has them." "Explain." The human pointed toward the forest outside. "This world has rules too." He tapped the transparent wall lightly. "Pay attention to the animals." Another tap. "Respect the weather." Another. "Never assume the environment is finished changing." The room listened carefully. Most people think survival is about fighting the world. His gaze moved toward the darkening horizon. It is not. Silence settled around the group. Then Mason continued quietly. "Survival is about listening." The words seemed surprisingly simple. Yet nobody laughed. Not after what they had learned. Outside, the crimson forest swayed beneath the evening wind. Inside, General Veolyra found herself realizing something profound. Mason Reed had not survived 15 Deathworlds because he was stronger than them. He had survived because he understood them. And somehow, that realization made his story even more extraordinary than anyone had imagined. The following morning brought a discovery far more important than the ruins. It began with something small, almost invisible. General Veolyra Thorne was reviewing overnight reports when one of the environmental researchers requested immediate access to the command center. The scientist arrived carrying a portable scanner and a look of complete disbelief. "General," he said, activating a holographic display. "We finally understand why the tunnel network exists." The image expanded above the table. Underground thermal maps appeared first, then biological readings, then migration patterns collected from orbit. Within seconds, the relationship became obvious. Every major life form on the planet moved according to the same system. The tunnels, they were not hiding places. They were survival routes. Ancient pathways connecting safer regions whenever the environment shifted. The room fell silent as the implications became clear. Entire ecosystems survived by adapting, constantly moving, constantly changing. Nothing remained fixed. Nothing depended on stability. Mason Reed studied the display from the back of the room. Then he nodded. That makes sense. Several scientists immediately looked toward him. Of course it makes sense to you, one muttered. The human smiled slightly, but said nothing. The researcher continued explaining. This world experiences dramatic environmental changes every few weeks. New maps appeared. Forests moved. Rivers changed direction. Migration zones shifted. Entire habitats transformed. The planet itself behaved like a living organism adapting to new conditions. General Veolyra watched the data scroll across the display. So everything survives by changing. Exactly, the scientist replied. Species that fail to adapt disappear. Another silence followed. Then Mason quietly set down his coffee. That is true everywhere. The room turned toward him. The human looked almost embarrassed by the attention. Not just here. He pointed toward the shifting maps. This planet simply does it faster. Something about that statement lingered in the room. Outside the command center, the crimson forest swayed beneath a warm morning wind. Researchers continued reviewing the environmental models while Mason walked toward the observation platform overlooking the valley. General Veolyra followed. The landscape stretched for miles beneath golden sunlight. Red forests, black mountains, silver rivers winding through endless wilderness. Beautiful, dangerous, alive. For several minutes neither spoke. Then the general finally asked the question that had been growing in her mind since the archive was opened. What is the difference? Mason looked toward the horizon. Difference between what? You and everyone else. The human laughed quietly. There is not one. Mason, I am serious. He leaned against the railing. The galaxy keeps treating survival like a special talent. The wind carried the scent of wet earth from the valley below. It is not. Veolyra watched him carefully. Then why did nobody else survive 15 Deathworlds? Mason remained silent for a moment. Then he looked toward the shifting landscape. Because most species spend their lives trying to make the universe comfortable. The general frowned slightly. And humans? Humans expect the universe to be uncomfortable. The answer settled into the silence between them. Simple, honest, difficult to argue with. Mason pointed toward the valley below where entire sections of forest appeared to be slowly migrating across the terrain. This world survives because it adapts. His gaze moved toward the distant mountains. So do humans. For the first time, General Veolyra began to understand. The secret was not strength, not intelligence, not courage. Every advanced species possessed those qualities. The difference was adaptation. Humans accepted change, endured it, learned from it, sometimes even welcomed it. The realization felt strangely profound. Behind them, the camp continued operating normally. Researchers analyzed data. Officers coordinated missions. Scientists debated theories. Yet everything felt different now, because the mystery surrounding Mason Reed was finally beginning to reveal something much larger. The story was never really about one human surviving 15 Deathworlds. The story was about why humans could survive them at all. 3 days later, the fleet prepared to leave the planet. The mission objectives had been completed. The tunnel networks were mapped. The ancient ruins were documented. Environmental data filled entire archives. Yet among all the discoveries collected during the expedition, none received more attention than the quiet human medic who spent his mornings drinking coffee while explaining Deathworld survival like a man discussing the weather. The landing zone buzzed with activity beneath clear skies. Cargo containers moved toward transport ships. Scientists packed equipment. Survey teams completed final reports. General Veolyra Thorne stood near the command platform overlooking the valley one last time. The crimson forest stretched toward the horizon beneath golden sunlight. In the distance, migrating wildlife followed ancient pathways through the landscape exactly as they had for thousands of years. The planet continued adapting, surviving, enduring. Much like the human she had come to respect. A notification appeared on her wrist display. Final mission summary approved. She closed the report and noticed Mason standing near the edge of the plateau. Alone, as usual. The general walked over quietly. The fleet departs in 40 minutes. I know. You seem disappointed. Mason smiled faintly. A little. Vaelira looked toward the valley. Most people are eager to leave Deathworlds. Most people do not spend enough time listening to them. The answer made her laugh softly. It was a very human response. For several moments they stood in comfortable silence. Wind moved through the grass. Sunlight reflected from distant rivers. Somewhere beyond the forest, unseen creatures called to one another. Life continued. Finally the general spoke. The records were wrong. Mason looked surprised. About what? About your classification. He raised an eyebrow. Which one? Survival case. The human chuckled. That one seems accurate. No, Vaelira shook her head slowly. It is incomplete. Mason waited. The general looked toward the vast wilderness below. Those records describe what you survived. Her gaze shifted toward him. They do not describe what you learned. For the first time, the human had no immediate reply. The silence lasted several seconds. Then he looked away, almost embarrassed by the compliment. The fleet departure alarm echoed across the plateau. Personnel began moving toward the transports. Above them, ships glimmered against the blue sky. Mason picked up his medical bag, the same bag he had carried across countless worlds. We should go. Yes, the general said. Yet neither moved immediately. Both continued watching the planet. The forests, the mountains, the endless landscape that had revealed a truth neither expected to find. Eventually Vaelira extended her hand. The human looked at it for a moment before shaking it. A simple gesture. Nothing dramatic. Nothing ceremonial. Yet it carried more meaning than any medal or title. Thank you, Mason Reed. For what? The general smiled. For reminding the galaxy what humanity actually is. Minutes later the transports lifted toward orbit. The crimson world slowly shrank beneath them. Inside the shuttle, Mason settled into his seat and closed his eyes. Around him, scientists discussed discoveries and officers reviewed reports. Outside the window, the Deathworld became a distant sphere of red and gold. General Vaelira watched it disappear into the darkness of space. Then she glanced toward the sleeping medic nearby and finally understood the lesson hidden inside 15 impossible survivals. The galaxy feared Deathworlds because they never stopped changing. Humans survived them because they never stopped changing either.